This is a fan-generated show. If you'd like to support us, please go to jamieglazov.com. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our new Rumble channel. All your support is greatly appreciated.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm thrilled to announce the release of my new book, Obama's True Legacy: How He Transformed America. There's a reason why Mike Huckabee calls it a ferocious and chilling read. Order it now at Amazon.com or at FrontPageMag.com. Good evening. Welcome to the Glazov Gang. Tonight, another fantastic program with another fantastic guest. Ladies and gentlemen, please remember we're a fan-generated program. We need all the help we can get. Go to our YouTube channel and our Rumble channel and subscribe and press instant notifications. Follow us at jamieglazov.com and subscribe to our newsletter and hit the donate button when you're in a generous and inspired mood. Follow us at Jamie Glazov on X and on Facebook. Most importantly, support Annie Cyrus and her fight for freedom at liveuptofreedom.com. Back by popular demand, Robert Spencer, the director of Jihad Watch. Robert, welcome back to the program.
Jamie, it is so good to see you, and I wonder why you were speaking so quickly.
Robert, so much to discuss this week. Let's begin. You've always got a new book out. Let's begin with your new book.
Okay. Well, I have actually two, because there's Muhammad, a critical biography, which is just out in, October? And then Antisemitism, History and Myth coming in March. And I just got some advanced copies of it. It looks great. You can pre-order it now. Antisemitism, History and Myth.
Okay, tell us a little bit about each, please.
Muhammad, a critical biography, is an in-depth look at the stories of Muhammad that we find in Islamic tradition and an evaluation of them from a historical standpoint, showing that they actually have no historical value. So while it's very important to know what Muhammad said and did because Muslims believe it and act upon it, it's also important to know that these things are not historical accounts. They are myths, legends, fables, and fictions.
Are you trying to outdo me in speaking quickly?
Well, Jamie, actually, you inspired me to try to speak in a fluent and cogent manner while briskly moving along so that the whole show does not bog down. What we need to do is try to eschew and avoid the all-present temptation to say, actually, and so what we need to do is focus and work and think carefully about what we are saying when we are saying it, be completely in control of our faculties and the presentation so that we can speak in a manner that is entertaining to the audience while continuing to bring incisive content to our devoted watchers and listeners.
Okay, fantastic. You know what? Annie and I need to hire you to do promotional advertising for our
Glazov Gang, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Glazov Gang. The Glazov Gang, the most incisive, thought-provoking, and enlightening television talk show available today. You may not have heard of Jamie Glazov, but let me tell you something. He has heard of you. Because Jamie Glazov keeps in touch with the pulse of our nation and our changing world. And Jamie Glazov is the man to turn to understand what is that pulse at a time that is so crucial in human history.
Okay. Robert, you haven't had a couple drinks before the show, right?
No, sir. No, sir.
Okay, Robert. So
drink before going on the air.
Robert, we really appreciate it. So, Robert, overall, your research in terms of the Muhammad book has more or less convinced you that Muhammad did not exist, correct?
That is correct, yes. I started out when I was first researching a book I wrote way back in 2006 when you were in third grade. I wrote a book that was called The Truth About Muhammad. And that was a biography of Muhammad based on the earliest Islamic sources, just as this one is, but the truth about Muhammad was more or less a straight retelling of the standard story about Muhammad, which was much less known to Americans then than it is today. The story of his marriage to the 9-year-old girl, of his leading of battles and raids, his anti-Semitism, all these things, that was all in that book. But I did not touch on the historical value of the stories themselves. And yet, the more that I looked into it, and the more I researched for that book, I saw that there were very large problems with the narrative that this was the standard narrative, not only that Muslims adhere to, but that academics teach in our universities today. And so I wrote several years after that, Did Muhammad Exist?, which was an in-depth exploration of the historical problems surrounding the material about Muhammad. And now in the new book, Did Muhammad a Critical Biography? It's an exploration of the actual stories about Muhammad and evaluating them in light of the earlier research that I did about their historical value. And also I found a lot of Islamic traditions that contradict the standard narrative that we never hear about nowadays, but they're in there.
Okay, what Muslim scholars and overall members of the Muslim community have given you a very credible and powerful exchange of ideas and documents and research, et cetera, on your findings?
No, Muslim scholars just heap scorn upon all this and say that the evidence for Muhammad's existence is very strong, and they point to some early mentions of somebody named Muhammad from the 7th century, but those actual accounts do not confirm, excuse me, they do not confirm that Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, existed, because they don't correspond to the stories of Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam. Actually, they differ from what we are told about him later in many important details. And that's all discussed in the book. They have not generally engaged with this material at all. They generally just say that, oh, I'm an Islamophobe, and that's the end of it. The idea that these things could be true, that is something they're really, of course, hoping to divert people from even considering by calling me names.
Robert, on a scale of 1 to 100, 100 being the most certain, where do you rank in terms of believing that Muhammad didn't exist?
Oh, I'm at 100. I don't have any doubt about it whatsoever. There's no independent attestation of this man's existence at the time that he lived. There is no mention of him, and this is what's most striking, all the while that the Arabs are conquering half the world and subduing it. There's no mention of Muhammad or Quran or Islam. Or very scant mention of Muhammad and no mention of Quran or Islam. And you got to think that just doesn't make any sense. If Quran and Islam existed, why is nobody talking about them at all, ever, while the Arabs are conquering? Sophronius of Jerusalem, the patriarch of Jerusalem, in the 630s, when the Arabs conquered Jerusalem, he speaks extensively. He leaves a great deal of writings behind about the conquest and how he's wrestling with it from a theological standpoint. But he never gives the shadow of a hint that the conquerors have a new religion. And that's an extraordinary omission if they really did. And the religion had motivated their conquest.
Okay, so then what's going on here then? What is Islam based on then, and who created this mythical character and why? And what are the ramifications of your findings to this religion?
Well, my findings destroy Islam, actually. That's why they're ignored. They don't have an answer. And so they have to ignore it, because otherwise the whole house of cards falls down. But what seems to be most likely is that Abdul Malik, who was the caliph from 685 to 705 of that Arab empire, and his lieutenant, the governor of Iraq, Hajjaj ibn Yusuf. They constructed Islam and invented Muhammad because they wanted a religion that they could use to unify their empire. In those days, you didn't have constitutions or parliaments. The unity of an empire was formed by its having a common religion. This is why the ecumenical councils of the early church were held at that time in order to unify the Roman Empire and to define what it meant for the Christian Roman Empire, what it meant to be a full citizen, that you believed in these things that were delineated by the councils. The Persian Empire, which was the other great power of the day, was Zoroastrian, and Zoroastrianism was the center of its unity. Both of these were multi-ethnic empires. It was not nationality that bound them together. It was the common religion. So the Arabs had amassed this massive empire and brought all these disparate peoples under their sway. And then they began to develop this religion that would unify and solidify the unity of their empire. And so it was Abdul Malik and Hajjaj ibn Yusuf. There are a number of reasons to think this. One of them is a telling little detail that comes out of Islamic tradition. An old man in Iraq, he says, we never read the Quran in mosques before the time of Hajjaj ibn Yusuf. Now, that doesn't make any sense if you take the standard story, because the standard story is that Uthman, the caliph in the 650s, codified the Quran, brought all the people who'd memorized parts of the Quran together, standardized the text, and then distributed the Quran to all the provinces. So by the time of Hajjaj, they should have had the Quran for almost 50 years. And instead, we have this weird story where the guy says, we only got started reading the Quran recently when Hajjaj was around. So what is much more likely is that there was no Quran at the time of Uthman, and that the story that he is the one who is responsible for the Quran is false, because, well, obviously, if it were around, somebody would have quoted it, but there's no mention of it anywhere. And it's only later, it's only actually after Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, or at the time of Hajjaj, that you start to get quotes from the Quran. And so it seems likely that Abdul Malik and Hajjaj and the other people around them created Islam, put the Quran together, invented Muhammad to create this religion that would unify and strengthen their empire.
But Robert, it's absolutely amazing that you get zero dialogue and scholarly exchange with the Islamic intelligentsia or scholars on this.
Oh, they're so how you say, uncompromising. I mean, like this. When I wrote my first book way back before you were born, I wrote my first. It was 2001. I wrote my first book, Islam Unveiled, and I really actually thought that there would be Islamic scholars who would deal with this honestly, and we'd have a good dialogue. And instead, they started calling me a hate monger and an Islamophobe. And I thought, wait a minute, you don't know me. You don't know if I hate anybody. And I didn't write this out of hate. I wrote this in good faith to ask some serious questions. But for them, if you say anything remotely critical about Islam or Muhammad or Quran, then you're just full of hate and they're not going to deal with you. Yeah. And that's how they've dealt with me now for all these years.
Bizarre. How do you feel when somebody calls you an Islamophobe?
Well, now it's like breathing. It happens so much. I don't really think about it. Yeah. But it used to bother me a great deal, because I would think, well, this is a fine situation, really, where people are using ad hominem attacks to impugn all this work that I've done, which I think is actually in good faith. It's reasonable and useful work. And so it's a shame that it's stigmatized so, but that's also, of course, the left as well as Islam.
Yeah, but Robert, sometimes, I just wonder in your case that when an intellectual is working on his work, in general, he expects some feedback from the world. What you do in many respects, highly valuable, the truth, great scholarship, but it's very surreal and bizarre that the world very much ignores you, right?
Yeah, well, what are they going to say? You know, people who write in political realms, that's easy because people deal in that all the time and they feel like they know the subject. But when people are confronted with my work, you have two kinds of people who are on the other side. You have leftists who are sure that any criticism of Islam is racist and bigoted and Islamophobic. And so they also don't know anything about Islam. So they can't answer in any detail. They can't deal with what I write in any depth. They can
Yeah,
just call names. And then
right.
you have Muslims who are threatened because I'm challenging the foundations of their most cherished beliefs.
Yeah.
And all they know to do, because it's the example of Muhammad, is to call names and say that I'm a racist, bigoted Islamophobe. And they know Islam, but they don't want to engage me even if they would engage somebody that they think so little of.
Mm.
But even if they wanted to, they wouldn't because they don't want these things coming out. And so there are plenty of Muslims want to debate me, but they want to debate about Christianity or they want to debate about something else. They never want to talk about Islam. You look at somebody like uh, the last guy I debated, Javad Hashmi, or Daniel Hakikaju, who is a guy who's out there trying to debate everybody he can. And Hakikaju, if you say, hey, yeah, let's debate about is Islam true, he'll turn you down. He wants to debate about the Trinity or something like that, where he thinks he can win. Um, they know they can't deal with these issues and they don't want people thinking about them, so they just avoid them.
What was that character? He seems to have disappeared, or maybe I just haven't seen him. But Reza Aslan, and if I'm correct, he wrote a book on whether Jesus existed or not, in terms of.
It was called Zealot, and it was about how Jesus was actually a zealot, which was a political group that was seeking a political rebellion against Rome. And this was not a new idea. There have been other biblical scholars who've claimed that Jesus was a zealot. It's not a very strong case, but it's an old case. Reza just put it together again. And because the culture is so attuned to hating Christianity and hating Christ, it became a big bestseller. It became such a big bestseller that I think Reza was able to go into a kind of semi-retirement. And whoever writes his books for him, they're writing somebody else's books instead.
Goodness. Okay, but you would think that if he's interested in Jesus Christ and his existence and identity, etc., that maybe he might be interested in the character and existence of Muhammad and maybe engage you on your work.
No, no, actually, Reza several times has turned down opportunities to debate me, and I think I know why, of course, because he knows how badly he'd be shown up. But Zealot is an exercise in trying to bridge the gap by making Jesus out to be violent, and in other contexts, he's tried to make Muhammad out to be peaceful. So he's inverting reality, but doing so in a way that is kind of exculpatory for Islam because if you see Muslims being violent, then he can say, well, see, this is really something that Jesus is just like that. And so it's not that's Christians shouldn't be on their high horse about it. And so he's not going to discuss this with anybody because anybody knowledgeable because it's such a ridiculous notion and he knows it would get torpedoed.
Very twisted, monstrous psychology. And on that note, there's another twisted, monstrous psychology, which is that of anti Semitism. Your book definitely, well, I think the topic of your book is always relevant and timely due to this tragic issue and you could say dark issue of anti Semitism. And at the moment, extremely relevant because scaringly enough, if that's a word to use, or frighteningly enough, we see Jew hatred rising. At the same time, the Jews are the victims of an escalating violence and genocide with October 7th, etc., etc. Um, what do you bring to the table with your book?
Anti Semitism, History and Myth which you can pre-order now at Amazon and Barnes & Noble, as well as wherever fine books are sold. Anti-Semitism, History and Myth is an exploration of what happened after October 7th, that suddenly the West loves the jihadis and hates Israel. And hatred of Israel and outright hatred of Jews is suddenly fashionable again. And you see Candace Owens retailing all these old Nazi anti-Jewish theories, and even Tucker Carlson and other people who should know better. And so I go into, in the first part of the book, where all this comes from and exploring what are the roots of the hatred of Jews in pre-Christian Europe, in Christianity, in Islam, and in national and international socialism. And then in the second half of the book, I go through some of the main theories, the main claims that are made by the Jew haters, like that the Talmud is some manual for subverting Gentile society, that the Jews kill Christian children and mix the blood in their Passover matzahs, that the Holocaust was fake in order to justify the creation of the state of Israel. The Jews control the media, various things like that, and show that in many cases they are put forth today by people who hold to some of those ancient anti-Semitic ideas that come out of Christianity or come out of Islam or come out of National Socialism, which of course is resurgent today, or international socialism, which is very much still with us, and show why there's nothing to them. And so I hope that it will be a guide that will lead some people back to some common sense, or lead some people away from the brink and keep them from buying the kind of stuff that Candace is selling. I hope that it'll have some effect in all that.
I know we can't approach issues like this with just 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and they're very obviously deep issues, but what in your findings do you find lurking beneath the surface of creating this hatred?
Really, I think in all cases, the common thread is that these groups identify the Jews in some way as the opposite of what they're trying to do, the chief opponent. Now, why it's always the Jews, I think that's ultimately an eschatological and spiritual question, and that's something we could get into. But for Christians, of course, there was the charge that the Jews killed Jesus, and there were Jews who were involved. But it's really a very strange charge when you look into it, when you think about it, because the death of Jesus is supposed to be sacrificial and redemptive. And so how is it that this, and also it's supposed to have been caused by the sins of the whole world, which he takes upon himself. And I've seen so much spiritual material in the Catholic and the Orthodox traditions that say that it's our sins that put him on the cross. And it is our sins that he cleanses from us by his sacrifice on the cross. This is standard basic Christianity. And yet somehow the Christian anti-Semites say, yes, but the Jews are really at fault. And it was this terrible thing that they killed him. Well, actually, if the Jews killed him in a way that makes them more blameworthy than anybody else, then how is it that it was our sins that put him on the cross? And if his death was sacrificial and redemptive, how is it that it's this horrific thing for which they bear the blame? And if it was some Jews, it was also some Romans. Why is it that we blame the modern day Jews but not modern day Italians? And all these logical questions about it. But ultimately, for the Christian anti-Semites, the Jews are the quintessential Antichrist, the ones who rejected the Messiah and are always trying to destroy the church and Christianity as sort of the same motion as their rejection of the Christ. So then you have Islam, and Islam in the same way. characterizes the Jews as the worst enemies of the Muslims, and actually says that explicitly in the Quran, and portrays them as perversely and wickedly rejecting the message of Muhammad when he was just a prophet like their prophets. And so in both cases, you have this people who is essentially scapegoated and collectivized and considered to be responsible in the aggregate for the opposition to the message that is being spread. And then National Socialism is the idolatry of race and blood, the idolatry specifically of the so-called Aryan race, or the Germans, and in particular. And Hitler in Mein Kampf, long before he took power, identifies the Jews as kind of the quintessential anti-Germans, and the people who are like Islam, the core enemies of the Germans. And so if the Germans are going to live their essential Germanness as the master race, then they have to divest Germany of all Jewish influence, because Jewish influence is quintessentially un-German. And Karl Marx, in a very similar way, wrote that the Jews were the quintessential capitalists, and capitalism was the root of evil in the world. And so to eradicate the evil in the world, the Jews all had to become communists, and then they would blend into the larger communist aggregate and lose their essential identity. And in all cases, all four of those groups, they want the Jews to disappear, because only by their disappearing is the major group reaffirmed in its identity, and then the enemy is defeated. And so that's what I think is at the bottom of all of it, that the Jews are this irreducible people. They've gone through all these centuries. They're one of the oldest people on earth. You don't find Canaanites and Perizzites and Jebusites and Hittites and Amalekites on the earth today. They've all died out. They've all blended in with other people, and we don't call them that. But the Jews still are here. And that many Christians have seen that throughout history as an eschatological sign in itself, a sign of the presence and the providence of God. But it also indicates that you have this people that won't assimilate. They will not join the larger group. And so when you have these larger groups that are calling everybody to join, this one group that won't join is a thorn in the side.
Well, thank you, Robert. There's a lot there. Let me just say a few things on my mind, and then I'll hand it over to you. So, Roy Showman, who is a Catholic Jew, he was Jewish ethnically, but also Jewish by faith, but he converted to Roman Catholicism. He has written a fascinating book, Salvation Comes from the Jews, or something like that. I might not be getting the title exactly right. But yeah, but yes, and a few of the things so first he stresses that for us Christians, if something is holy at the root, then we have to keep that in mind of what our roots are, and that they're holy roots. And I think on a spiritual level, when we look at this, I believe in the existence of Satan, and he definitely hates God's creation, and he's terrified, obviously, of Jesus Christ and of the salvation that his crucifixion bestowed on humanity, but he also hates the Jewish people because they're God's people. So I see very much a satanic influence behind Hitler, behind jihad. There's a war on God's chosen people on many levels. I think we also have to remember in all of this that Jesus and his mom and most of his disciples were Jewish. These are all things that we must keep in mind. Does that inspire any comment from you?
Yeah, I think that it's very important, and that Christian anti-Semites should also remember a passage from St. Paul in the letter to the Romans, where he's talking about how the Jews, the gifts and the call of God are irrevocable, he says. And so well, I'm an Orthodox Christian, and I know that many Orthodox Christians believe that the church is the replacement for the
Uh-huh.
people of Israel, and that God rejected the people of Israel utterly, and that the church is the new Israel, so that the Jews have no place in God's scheme of things nowadays. And I think that they ignore that verse and its implications. That if the gifts and the call of God are irrevocable, and Paul also talks about how the Jews will be engrafted in at some point, this is something that we don't know exactly how this is going to work out. And a lot of Jews themselves, of course, object to this line of discourse because it suggests that they will all convert to Christianity, and this is something that they have objected to in the recent years, and proselytizing efforts among them, and so on. But I'm not even discussing that. I'm talking about just the fact that they're not rejected in the Christian scheme of things.
Mhm.
Christian scriptures, the chief apostle, or the most important apostle in terms of writing those scriptures, he says that the gifts and the call of God are irrevocable. That means the Jews still have them
Mm.
in some way that
Mm.
will become clear at some point. And
Mhm.
so for Christians to act as if they're cast off and should be, well, I see such terrible anti-Semitism from, especially from Orthodox Christians online, and it makes me ashamed. And I don't think there's any call for it or any justification for it.
Um, Look, I'm just speaking for myself here, never enforcing my views or anything, just putting them on the table. In terms of my study of just the theology and different perspectives and prophecies and what different theologians say, just an accumulation of it, that Satan has a lot of wisdom, but he doesn't have access to all of divine wisdom in the sense that he thinks he can still stop some things. And as Roy Schoeman shows, that salvation comes from the Jews in our Christian understanding. Jesus came the first time through the Jewish people, and which is part of the reason why God wanted to make them distinct and separate, as you were saying, that because it was important for Jesus' parents and his mom to be Jewish, but that the second coming also very much involves the Jewish people. And Satan thinks he can somehow stop the second coming. And so then what Hitler tried to do, what Jihad tried to do, that actually begins to make some sense in terms of if this is a spiritual war, who's trying to kill all the Jews and why. Just something that I've given a lot of thought to in my life. Don't have even close to even some of the answers, but it's something that I give a lot of thought to. But if you're against the Jewish people, I would say you're definitely on the evil side, and you're definitely going against God's promise to Abraham, right?
I would think so. I don't know how to see that otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I it mystifies me. I grew up, and all the years when I was a young man, I did not encounter Christian anti-Semitism, and only recently, especially after October 7th, has it come back in force. And I think that's extremely unfortunate.
Well, in my work, Robert, in United in Hate with the Left, what I found and showed and tried to show was that the more killing and evil, the more excited the left gets. And so when the Stalinist killing machine was in full force, the fellow travelers and the political pilgrims and the leftists were just in ecstasy. And then we find that with Maoist China. And then with 9/11, when you saw the left and just how excited it became. And with October 7th, very much we see the same thing, because you would think that what October 7th was, you would think that anybody with half a brain and a heart would recoil in horror and take the side of the Jewish people. And yet we see very much the opposite in the realms of the left and in other realms, right?
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
of course, we know that they love death, they love destruction. This is why they unite with Islam. One of the reasons why they ally with Islam, which also proclaims, the jihadis routinely say, we will win because we love death. You love life.
Yeah.
And they are proud of their love of death.
Our beloved and wonderful Annie Cyrus is an expert on many of these things and has devoted her life to thinking about many of these things and praying over them. Annie, any thoughts on our discussion so far?
Well, I appreciate what you said. I would say in comparison between you and Robert, I don't have anything close to expertise when, especially the historical facts. But thank you for allowing me to come into the discussion. Let me do this. Let me do this slow motion, and gather my thoughts so I can be very careful. I do want to bring in a different possibility. I agree with everything you said, both of you, 100%. However, I do want to also say, since October 7th until now, one of the things that has been translated wrongly into anti-Semitism has been a group of people, me included, criticizing the Israeli government on their actions and reactions that has turned into anti-Semitism. So this is really tiny, kindergarten topic, Robert, compared to what you guys have talked until now. But do you mind open?
Annie, wait, Annie, you're saying that sometimes there could be legitimate criticisms, let's say, of something the Israelis are doing, and it's automatic, the people who are articulating it are automatically accused of being anti-Semitic, right?
Exactly.
Okay,
Yes.
okay,
And
yeah.
that's that. If Robert, if you could elaborate on yes, anti-Semitism by definition, reading it off a dictionary for me is when you're hostile towards the Jewish people. But does it also apply to criticizing or being hostile toward Israeli government?
I can't see how it would, but I know what you're talking about. There are people, although seriously though, I more often see people saying, if you criticize the Israeli government, you're accused of anti-Semitism, than I actually see people doing that. In other words, the anti-Semites like to claim that, I think, more than it actually happens. I don't think there's any reason why the Israeli government can't be criticized or shouldn't be criticized. The only reason why that would be classified as anti-Semitism in any legitimate way would be if they said, see, the Israeli government did this thing, and therefore the Jews are evil. Therefore, this shows that the Jews have this insidious agenda or something. That's obviously anti-Semitic. But to say the Israeli government, it's very questionable. Well, why the heck they dropped the ball so spectacularly and so comprehensively on October 7th? Why did they wait hours to respond? Were they so unprepared for this? And so that's in itself an indictment. And if they did it on purpose, was it because of the left elements in the government that wanted to create a pretext to topple Netanyahu? Or was it Netanyahu's own negligence or some other calculus? All this needs to come out, but I think it should come out.
And what's interesting there, Robert, is I have quite a few Jewish friends who are very skeptical of what you're talking about, the response and what happened. And there's a lot of questions, but they'll whisper in my ear and say, unfortunately, we have to do the work here, because if non-Jews bring it up, they're going to be accused of anti-Semitism. So we got to bring this up.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I don't have any problem with that.
Yeah.
And I've never hesitated to criticize the Israeli government whenever it warrants criticism.
Yeah.
And I think this, you know, like I love Trump, but I think this ceasefire deal that Trump is going around taking credit for is a disaster. And Netanyahu signed on to it. Now, was he pressured to? Does he think it's a good idea too? I don't know, but I think that there's a lot to criticize in that regard. And I would never hesitate. And I don't think that anybody need hesitate to criticize the Israeli government where they're really wrong, being careful not to pick up Palestinian propaganda about things they didn't really do. But
Well, I'm sorry, so sorry for interrupting. What is so important, what Annie's bringing up here, is also these double standards of the left, because they like to, like even with Musk recently, and I don't think that those gestures he made were very smart in some ways, but I don't think he meant to do a Nazi salute or anything like that. But all of a sudden, the left is very concerned about anti-Semitism and how he put his hand out. And, so the left loves to make accusations of anti-Semitism when, in fact, they're in league with the greatest anti-Semites. So the charge of anti-Semitism, when it's inappropriate, can very much harm our effort to fight the real anti-Semitism.
absolutely.
Right. But Annie, sorry, I didn't mean to hijack that. Go ahead.
No, it's okay. So, thank you for that, Robert. Now, let me play very, what do we call devil's advocate here? Let me play a liberal here. So, if I'm criticizing Netanyahu, and I'm rightfully criticizing Netanyahu, I am still criticizing a Jew. Doesn't that make me anti-Semite for being hostile?
Well, this is what they did, the left did with Soros. Soros is Jewish ethnically, but Soros, by his own admission, you can get the video readily on YouTube, he aided the Nazis during World War II and said he had no regrets about doing so. So if you criticize Soros nowadays, they'll say you're anti-Semitic. Now, I think that's the most ridiculous thing I ever heard, because this guy, you could say that he himself is anti-Semitic on the basis of his actions in World War II. But to criticize a Jew is just criticizing a Jew if you're criticizing his actions. If you go on and say, this shows then, see how evil the Jews are and their secret plan to subvert the world or whatever, then obviously that's crossing the line. But if you criticize me, or you criticizing Christianity or all Christians, that would be ridiculous. And if you criticize an Indian, are you criticizing all Hindus and Hinduism? It doesn't make any sense. And it doesn't make any sense in this context either.
Thank you. That's what. So, if I understand correctly, one of the confusions that a lot of people I see face is they can't separate the Jewish by race versus Jewish by religion. They are one within, but they're still two different entities, right?
I think, if I may, I think what you mean to say here, and pardon me if I'm getting it wrong, but if I understand you correctly, you mean that people have trouble separating or distinguishing individuals as Jews from Judaism. And so they think if you are criticizing an individual who's Jewish, that means you are denigrating all of Judaism and are anti-Semitic. And this is the same problem that we get when we talk about Islam, or that I get when I talk about Islam. And it's completely illegitimate as far as I'm concerned. And it also is in this context that people say, if I say Islam teaches warfare against unbelievers, people will say, but my friend Ahmed is the nicest guy. He's so sweet and gentle. And as if that means, oh, Islam doesn't teach warfare against unbelievers. And they can't distinguish between Muslim individuals and what Islam is all about. And one of them is a person who has many influences, and the other is the book and the doctrine and the teaching And so it's the same thing here, that if you are talking about what some guy who is Jewish does, that only pertains to him because he has any number of influences. And it's only anti Semitic when it comes into people saying, this guy he shows that the Jews are up to no good in this way, and so on. Like pornography. That's actually something I talk about in the book, that there were Jews involved in pornography, and a lot of the Jew haters online, they make a lot of this. They try to make out that pornography is this Jewish thing to poison the minds of non-Jews and destroy their families and so on. Well, okay, but maybe that's, I mean, maybe that's what pornography does. But the fact is, there are a lot of non-Jews involved in pornography, and probably the biggest name in the normalization of pornography in the United States was Hugh Hefner, who was not Jewish, and there were many others. And so, does I don't know what ethnicity Hefner was, but does that mean that his whole ethnicity is working on poisoning the minds of the people of the United States? Obviously, that would be absurd. And also, it's the same thing when you talk about pornographers who are Jews. So when you're talking about individuals, what they do is what they do, and it has a moral evaluation, and you can apply that. But that doesn't reflect on the whole religion itself.
Exactly. The double standard. I wanted to pose it here that the double standard. So if a Muslim man is screaming Allahu Akbar, comes into a mall and blows himself up, not all Muslims are like that. But if one person in Israeli government does something that is not good for Jewish people of Israel, then all Jews are bad.
No, you're
Well,
absolutely right.
well,
That's
Robert,
exactly what we see
Robert,
in all
real,
the hatred of Jews. Sorry, Jamie, just a second. That, for example, you take mass migration into Europe, and I have it in the book that there are some Jewish leaders who've said mass migration is great because we hate Christianity and it'll destroy Christian culture. And so the anti-Semites, they love this, and they publish these things as if mass migration in Europe is a Jewish plot. But the Pope is in favor of mass migration into Europe, and the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople, and all these Western leaders. So how come it's only when Jewish leaders say that mass migration is great that it becomes a Jewish thing? And they never say, oh, the Pope's for it. It's a Catholic thing. The Catholic Church is evil for wanting to destroy Europe. Well, why is it one true and not the other?
Robert, if I'm correct, you used an example one time that many Catholics use birth control, but it doesn't mean that Catholic teaching and Catholic doctrine is for birth control. The Church is against birth control, but many Catholics may practice birth control, but they're going against Catholic teaching. But what's different in the Muslim case is when, let's say, Muslims engage in sex slavery or rape of the infidel, they can actually find verses and teachings that sanction and inspire what they're doing. But Annie, go ahead. Did Robert answer your questions?
Oh, absolutely. And to actually, let's reverse what you just said, Jamie. Yeah, as you said, many Catholics use birth control, but the church is against it, right? The same thing. Yes, there are Muslims who will drink alcohol and eat pork and have girlfriends, but Islam is against it. That is the whole point of, I mean, the two of you, of course, you put it in way higher intellectual way, but mine is the more simple way is people need to wake up and realize that this game, so I actually learned this term today. I'm very proud. Some are playing the outsider game and some are playing the insider game, but the game is the same. As Robert example of Soros. Listen, Soros is the insider player for the game of twisting everything of narrative by the hands of left.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have
Zudi Jasser, who's an insider player, to convince everybody that, look, we have this hero who's a Muslim, believes in existence of Muhammad, however, found a way around it to reform it. So as long as people don't dissect this game, master the game, and become good at playing it, we're gonna continue facing skyrocketing anti-Semitism and an unlimited cover up for Islamization.
Yep.
Annie, thank you so much. And Robert, thank you so much. Just with a couple minutes left here. Robert, your thoughts on the first couple days of Trump's entrance into the White House? What do you think?
Exciting days, Jamie.
Yeah.
The man's on fire. He's working hard. He's getting so much done. Of course, the left will be resisting it every step of the way. There's already been a legal challenge to one of his executive orders. I forget which right offhand, but in any case, the battle is joined, and he's working hard to save America, to save the free world. He'll be remembered as a great man. Whether he succeeds or fails, he's got tremendous forces against him, but we can all pray that he will succeed, because if he doesn't, it's totalitarian international socialist America coming.
But Robert, there's something that feels very nice about just even having a president that's like talking to people and explaining things. There was some kind of surreal nightmare we were in. We had some kind of weird dementia patient walking around in the forest getting lost or something. So that in and of itself is a relief, right? I mean, in that first press conference he did while he was signing all that stuff, I think Trump talked and answered more questions in a half an hour than Biden did in 4 years.
Yeah. And he's so on top of things. He's not the most articulate individual in the world, and yet he's clearly showed that he has a grasp of a broad range of issues, that he is very laser focused on what he wants to accomplish, and determined to accomplish it to a degree that surpasses the energy of his first term. And so it's exciting times. I hope it keeps up.
Well, Robert, just a sec. I think maybe the context there. I think he's a great articulator. I love how he talks. I think he makes a lot of sense. Do you mean maybe not in the greatest intellectual context?
Yeah, I just mean that if you write out his words from an impromptu talk on anything, there'll be half sentences, aspects where what he's saying is quite clear, but it's more implied than stated, or stated in a roundabout way. Yeah. That's all. It's just that we're not talking about Winston Churchill, excuse me, or somebody like that. But
I love how he's very
him at all.
Yeah, I just love how
he is a great communicator. Yeah. You know, it's marvelous to see the rallies really where he's such a funny guy, and he relates so well with the crowd, because he's really an ordinary guy. He's not one of these leftist fakes like Kamala Harris, where every aspect of her life, every aspect of her public persona was a fraud, was a put on in order to appeal to various focus groups and constituencies. And it was nothing about her was authentic. With Trump, it's all real. And it's exhilarating to watch.
But Robert, it was a fascinating theater, just the inauguration. And when we were watching that on the TV, just with my eyes, it looked like on the left there was a whole bunch of angels, and on the right-hand side you just see all these demons. I mean, just looking at Hillary and Bill and just especially something looked very off with Doug, Kamala's husband, and then Obama's there. But what an incredible theater that was, and George Bush sitting there. But that's a bad crew, and these entities tried to destroy him. They tried to put him in prison. They tried to kill him, and there he is. And he comes on, and he was hitting hard, wasn't he? What did you think of that theater that we were watching?
Well, I thought that it was extraordinary. It was a wonderful thing to see. And the inaugural address, I thought, was tremendously hard-hitting. People were complaining and saying, oh, he's making all these empty promises. I don't think so. I think that he's calculating very important decisions and steps that need to be taken. And as he explained, we didn't give the Panama Canal to China. We gave it to Panama, and we're taking it back to keep it out of the hands of China. And that's what's behind what he's talking about with Greenland. And when he says the Gulf of America, that is to co-opt the Biden prohibition on drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. All of this was calculated, very carefully thought out. He's hitting the ground running. It was clear on that day, and it's been wonderful to see the last few days.
Just one of my something that I was analyzing, and something that when you look at Hillary, she can't even hide it. There is such tremendous pride and anger that she failed in something. She wanted that power. She wanted something and she didn't get it, and she wears it. You can see it on her. Like with Kamala, it's a little bit more, I don't know, maybe she wants to go have a drink, she can still giggle a little bit, but aside from
Still in the game. She could still get the nomination. I don't think she will, but she wants to get the nomination in 28. And maybe she'll run for governor of California in the meantime or something else. But Hillary, it's all in the past.
Yeah.
And she did not attain her primary goal. So
But
there's a big difference between the two.
Exactly, but with Kamala, she can still act a little bit civilized, still smile a little bit. She still comes across a little bit human, whereas with Hillary, you can just see the rage coming through her, right?
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, just one of impression I had. Very interesting. Michelle Obama's not showing up anywhere. Annie, just some of your observations on that?
My opinion might be a little unpopular here. I think definitely for me, 5 of his executive orders were absolutely amazing, a must. The pardons, I pray and I hope that he expedite the pardon of the pro-lifers who are still in prison. He definitely, yes, I actually made the comment that it is so good to listen to the president and actually giggle because he made a good joke, and be engaged because he's actually talking and he's not reading off a teleprompter and saying period, end of the line, next paragraph. However, I have a huge concern with his press conference. I had 3 words that is very concerning. I don't have all the facts and information to necessarily say, oh, let's, go mad. But AI made mRNA vaccine. That is getting my attention more than the fun and the jokes as of today. I really hope and pray. And again, I'm not putting this on President Trump. What I am putting on President Trump, that with my deepest study of Larry Ellison, President Trump might possibly be repeating a mistake of his first term. By first term, he created a monster we know as Fauci. Looks like he might be creating a second monster known as Larry Ellison. President Trump isn't planning to do damage with this investment, but Larry Ellison definitely is. So that's where my eyes are right now and ears to see where that one, I believe they're calling it a Stargate project, where that goes. Other than that, yes, amazing executive orders, and so far the smart moves, excluding that one.
Well, thank you, Annie. And I think as Christians, we have to really keep an eye on this, because everything that I'm studying and thinking and researching, just this AI overall opens up a certain portal to the demonic realms. So it's scary, the world we're heading into. But perhaps that's for another program. Robert, just some final words from you?
What you should be thinking about is that the times are never so bad that good people can't be good in them. And so remember that Jordan Peterson didn't make it up, although he popularized the idea. But it's true that you get your own house in order, and that is your primary responsibility to meet the world's problems. and there will always be problems. There will always be, as Jesus says, wars and rumors of wars, and we have to continue to be faithful, as Padre Pio said, to pray, hope, and don't worry.
Amen. Annie, any final word?
Yes, make sure to go to jihadwatch.org and pre-order Robert's book that's coming out. And then if you haven't purchased a copy of his previous book that came out on October, grab a copy of that, get educated, and then subscribe to his website and stay in touch, because he reports on jihad. Well, it's jihadwatch.org. He watches it, he reports it, then you can have easy access and stay educated.
Fantastic. Robert, one more time, the 2 books for our audience.
Muhammad, A Critical Biography, and Antisemitism, History and Myth.
Wow. Incredible how many books you put out, Robert. You very smart and fast working man with a fast and brilliant working mind. Thank you for everything that you do, Robert.
And thank you for everything you do, Jamie Glazov.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Annie Cyrus, very much as well. We'll see you soon on the Glazov Gang. Good night.